Welcome to Trial Lawyer Prep. What if you could hang out with trial lawyers and jury consultants? Ask them about connecting with clients and juries more effectively. Then take strategies, tactics, and insights to increase your success. Each week, Elizabeth Larrick takes an in-depth look at how to regain touch with the everyday world, understand the emotional burden of your clients and juries, and use focus groups in this process. Elizabeth is an experienced trial lawyer, consultant, and founder of Larrick Law Firm in Austin, Texas. Her goal is to help you connect with juries and clients in order to improve your abilities in the courtroom. Now, here's Elizabeth.
Hi there, it's Elizabeth. I wanted to pop in very quickly to introduce my guest, Kenny Berger. Kenny Berger is a plaintiff personal injury lawyer. He operates his own office over in South Carolina. He's got an office in Columbia and Myrtle Beach. His office operates with many personal injury areas, including workers' comp. So if you have a case or questions about South Carolina, be sure and reach out to him. His contact information will be in the show notes.
Hello, and welcome back to the podcast, Trial Lawyer Prep, with me, your host, Elizabeth Larrick. Today, we have a special guest joining us all the way from South Carolina, and we are going to talk about traumatic brain injury clients. Now, I know most folks who are tuning into this podcast have a litigation docket. And if you don't have a TBI client, because I know there's employment law and transaction law and other things, this is still a really good podcast to tune into if you have a case that comes your way. So you can kind of identify it, get at the right place. And a lot of times, I think what is coming out as well is that the more we learn about TBI, the more we recognize we've all probably had some kind of concussion in our lives. So always helpful to learn more about that. But enough of my jib jab. Kenny Berger, thank you so much for joining the podcast and welcome.
Thank you for having me on. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. So Kenny runs a personal injury law firm down in South Carolina, and I wanted him to come and talk real specifically with us today on this episode about traumatic brain injury. Now, we've never super dived deep into a specific type of damages. So I'm excited to have you, Kenny. I know that you talk a lot about this at CLEs, continuing legal education. There's a couple of those topics I know on your website. So I'm just going to throw it over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about TBI and how you got interested in helping these folks?
Yeah, thank you. So you're right. If you do any type of personal injury, or even if you don't, the likelihood of coming across somebody in your lifetime, friend, family member, colleague who has suffered a traumatic brain injury, these things are all just good to know, but especially folks who do personal injury. I think you've got to be familiar with traumatic brain injury. And my goal today isn't to do a deep dive in the science and kind of learn anybody as we go deeper into some dark abyss, but more just to point out some of what I think are real keys to unlocking what I call the power of your TBI case. And by unlocking the power, what you're really getting at is the truth, right? Getting to the core of the matter, the quote, what's really going on. And the way I got interested in these cases is neat. And there's a connection here, Elizabeth. So 11 or 12 years ago, something like that, I was out in Las Vegas at a reptile depositions seminar. And this was in, I think, maybe 2012. And I'm in line, and the two guys in front of me looked familiar. We're going to lunch on one of the breaks, and the two guys looked pretty familiar. Turns out they were a couple lawyers from South Carolina who ended up becoming good friends of mine, a guy named David Yarborough and William Applegate. And they've just been tremendously successful, great guys. But we ended up eating lunch together, and there was another attorney with us, a lawyer from California whose name I can't recall. But at lunch, the three of them, William, David, and this attorney from California, get to talking about brain injury cases. And as they're talking, I'm realizing, wait, a friend of mine had just called me about a case that sounded very similar to what they're describing. So after lunch, I go out into the hallway and I call my buddy and I said, hey, that case we were talking about, what are they offering you? He was like, they're offering $50,000. I'd take 60. I said, how much coverage is there? He was like, $500,000. I was like, whatever you do, don't settle your case. I think it's a policy limits case. And he was like, well, how so? And I was like, I think your client has a brain injury. I'll tell you all about it when I get back from Vegas. Well, What I then proceeded to do over the next couple of days, in addition to going to the deposition seminars, was learning as much as I could as quickly as possible about brain injury cases. And the fellow he was representing absolutely had a brain injury. There was just no doubt. He was different in terms of personality. He was different in terms of memory and attention and concentration. He was different in terms of his mood and his ability to control his anger. He was just a different person. And that's what so many people describe. So I ended up representing that young man. And along the way, what I learned is you had to know the medicine, you had to know the science. That was true. But it was just such a human story. It impacted every part of his life, every relationship he had. And along the way, I really got to know him and care about him and care about his family. And his life, Elizabeth, was a mess. On the way up to Columbia from where these folks lived down in Aiken, South Carolina, and he and his wife had an all-out freaking World War III kind of argument. It was just, they show up, and when they get here, he's red-faced, she's crying. It's like, what's going on? And it was exactly what people with brain injuries and their spouses experience. And we had to take, luckily, we prepped them and we sat down again with them before the deposition started, and more than anything, just worked to get everybody calmed down. But that was, again, 11, 12 years ago, something like that. And over the last decade and a little bit of change, we just took a real interest in not just brain injury cases, but the brain injury population. It's one of those things where it's the type of injury, kind of like other ones, but it could happen to any of us, right? And I've watched what people go through, from folks who would be considered kind of just working class, hard scrabble background, all the way up to corporate executive lawyer types with brain injuries and everyone in between. And to a person, they're all impacted just in a full scale, often hidden, often very apparent kind of way that certainly calls for help, perhaps above all else. And that's the short, skinny on how I first got involved in it. I guess it wasn't that short or skinny, but that's how I got involved in it.
Yep. Those deposition seminars, like I still remember, like those were my first reptile seminars. I still remember all the people that I met. I'm still in contact with them. But it's so amazing. Like you mentioned, all the backgrounds of people, and just, I think what also is so different is every TBI is so different. You named off some pretty traditional symptoms, but having worked in the field, like you see so many different flavors or symptoms, and it's just like, wow. And like you said, it's hidden, but it's apparent. Like if the people around them can see it, or maybe just a little bitty small things. I think the science and the recognition, when we run focus groups, people are much more familiar with it. And like there's definitely some language that people can talk about it a lot better, but I still feel like there's a pretty big gap in knowledge for people having an in-depth understanding about what it is. Is that kind of the way that you feel too?
I think that the challenge is helping people understand that what may have started with a quote concussion could have these kinds of ramifications. So one of the things I think you absolutely have to do is show that the mechanism of injury was sufficient to cause something terrible. Because what you're showing is kind of the snowball effect, or at least you've got to show that the mechanism of injury was enough to light the match, right? I think if you're dealing in a case where you've got to get a biomechanical expert, or you've got a car accident case or car wreck case with no property damage, and you're claiming millions and millions of dollars in damages based on a TBI, I think you better be darn certain that something can be shown, that if on the one hand you've got this raging fire, that people understand that whatever caused that raging fire, again, was at least enough to get the match lit. And what I tell folks a lot, for me, that the absolute start point is establishing that the client suffered a traumatic brain injury. Like, just, that's kind of an easy elementary point. It's like, well, yeah, of course. But I think that opens the door to so much else. And when we talk about a brain injury, the person doesn't have to lose consciousness. The person obviously doesn't have to have findings on a CT scan or an MRI scan. What you need to have, based on the Brain Injury Association of America or CDC or the DSM-5, or really anything, again, not to go too into the weeds, but it's real simple. There has to be some alteration in brain function. There might be confusion. There might be some amnesia surrounding the event. You just have to show there was some alteration in brain function. Now, a lot of times it's like, well, how do you do that? Because you'll see in medical records, they didn't lose consciousness. And then later on, they say they did lose consciousness. Well, most of the time, asking someone if they lost consciousness is like asking what you forgot yesterday. I don't know. No one forgot. So there are ways to deal with that. And one of the really simple ways to deal with it is to say, all right, what's the last thing you remember before we'll just say impact? Do you remember the impact itself? What is the very next thing after that? And the very next thing after that? And the very next thing after that? And typically what you'll find is there are pretty significant gaps in someone's memory, which is, again, by definition, post-traumatic amnesia. And a lot of times by the time the EMTs get there, by the time someone gets taken to an ER, they're alert, oriented. But before the EMTs get there, they may not be. So if they had a passenger with them, if somebody came up to their window, we hear that a lot, right? What's the next thing you remember? I remember somebody at my window. What do you remember between the impact and someone at your window? I don't remember anything. Well, you get in touch with the person who came to their window. What do you remember about them? They looked a little dazed. They were kind of out of it. Again, you start checking off those boxes where by definition, even if you can't document the loss of consciousness, you can certainly document the dizziness, the confusion, the altered mental status, the fact that on some level, their brain function was altered due to trauma. It could be a rear end collision that knocks their brain back and forth real quick, which is known as coup contre coup. That maybe they got hit in the head directly by something. But just remembering that if you can simply, and you must, I believe, establish by definition that this person had a traumatic brain injury, it really opens the door and kind of lays the foundation for whatever other damages may be causally related.
Sure. And I think like that's that whole causation and like you mentioned, the mechanism of injury, mechanism of event, that forward and backward, that is true battleground right there. And that's most of the time when you have a TBI case and the ER records are pretty much unhelpful, like that's the battleground that the opposing counsel is going to go after, which is, it's fine, it's great. You know, they didn't have to go to the emergency room, or if they did. So I think that's really probably one of the hardest parts. And I'll just speak for myself. When I did have a litigation docket, like I would get cases that like they did probably have one, but nothing was documented. And so there's this gap where they're having all these symptoms, but nobody's marking it down, or the chiropractor marks it down and it like that's as far as they get. So you did such a good job going through like at the scene and like trying to get the particular type of information and symptomology. But yeah, what else would there be?
And I'll tell you, we try to get people to tell us everyone they talked to or came in contact with for like the 48 hours following. Because again, a lot of times the EMS records suck. The ER record sucks. And they suck because the person's life isn't in danger. They're going to live. They just want to rule out a brain bleed. They rule out a brain bleed. They send them home. And one thing to know is in the ER record, it says, or the discharge paperwork, it says, hey, if you get worse, if any symptoms persist, go see a doctor. So that's one thing. If they come to see you and they haven't seen anybody, you can be like, hey, did your ER record say if your symptoms persist, come back to them or go see someone? They're like, yeah. And be like, well, that's probably a good thing to do. But we always want to find out, who did they talk to, right? Like, did they call somebody from the scene? A lot of times they'll call the spouse or the parent. And so you want to talk to the spouse or parent. And we had a case recently where the spouse was like, yeah, Joanna kept calling me. She called me 3 times. She'd call me. I'd hear some stuff. She'd be gone from the line, call me. And I got real worried. And finally I got in touch with her and she sounded kind of garbled. She didn't really sound like herself. I couldn't tell what was going on. And I was able to make out that she'd gotten in a wreck. Does that win your case? No. Is that great evidence? It's not great evidence, but it's just one more thing, one more person who can testify to the fact that from the very outset, right? Like from the very outset, this person was not the same mentally. Something happened. Their brain was not working the way it did before they were struck. Mm-hmm. They meet the definition of brain injury. And here are things we know about brain injuries. And you can go down a whole litany of things about brain injuries. And the fact is, when it comes to concussions, which is just a type of brain injury, when it comes to the concussions, which are known as mild traumatic brain injuries, that's just a crappy medical classification for the initial injury. It doesn't mean the consequences are mild. It doesn't mean the symptoms are mild. It doesn't mean the impact on someone's life is going to be mild. There's nothing mild about losing a marriage. There's nothing mild about losing your job. There's nothing mild about falling into depression, becoming suicidal. All these things that are often consequences of someone having brain damage are not mild. So you can work to disabuse people of the whole notion of mild. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of people, substantial percentage, get better, make a full recovery, and that's wonderful. What we often look at, though, is what are the similarities between people who don't get better, and what type of symptoms do they have? What type of consequences do they live with? So rather than comparing a population of people who didn't get hurt to people who did, we want to show the population of people who did get hurt what the similarities are. And in that setting, you find some textbook presentations, some classic presentations, symptoms. But like you said, there are also some individualized aspects because everyone's lives are different. And oftentimes TBIs affect every area of a person's life. And because of that, the impact on individuals varies. One of the added challenges in TBI cases is obviously that people typically look okay. They talk okay. If you spend 2 hours with them, it doesn't really seem to be a problem. If you spend 2 days with them, the problems become very clear, very pronounced. Because of that, we found over and over the people who are best positioned to tell that damages story are the lay witnesses, right? This is stuff that David Ball was talking about 15 years ago or more. But the people in a person's life who are best positioned to tell the damages story, typically it's not the person with the brain injury. Oftentimes they're in denial. There's still stigma that surrounds head injury. So in our experience, we want to go through a typical day and a typical week and find the people that our client interacted with and talk to them. We want to go on Facebook and find out, hey, who's that person? Or on Instagram, hey, who's that person you're doing that with? If someone says they loved going fishing, that's a common one in South Carolina. Okay, who do you used to go fishing with? Get in touch with that person, find out what's different. Obviously, the more removed you can get from the financial interest, the better. But if you're just hanging your hat, I think, on the client to tell their brain injury story, you're in a really tough position because it's kind of a no-win. Either they sound so bad that it's hard for someone to really wrap their head around giving that person money in the sense that they're so bad they can't describe or substantiate what's going on with them, or they sound pretty darn good, leaving jurors think, well, heck, why is this person getting a bunch of money? So if you want to know what they were like before and after, I've said it a bunch of times, the person with the brain injury is typically the last person you want to ask.
Yeah.
They don't typically have the types of insight in a day in, day out way that the friends, family, coworkers, neighbors, associates.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned a couple of things, and one was like concussion. And I hear a lot of times in focus groups, people say, well, that's not a brain injury. They just had a concussion, right? And so it's like, there's still this like loose, oh, it's different. Oh, that gets better. And no, this doesn't. And that sounds so serious to say brain injury. And I think that's kind of where a lot of times having the before and afters really solidifies, oh, like that, it's very relatable. But I think also the leaps and bounds that we have had in understanding like what it means in the brain, and like having some really good, I'm not going to say animations because I think illustrations are wonderful. And I think being able to describe it well also is very helpful. I want to ask you a real specific question though, because I know DTI imaging has come into popularity and some people are yes, some people are no. So like, how do you feel about like that kind of evidence?
Yeah. So what's funny, before we came on the podcast, I was saying we've done this CLE where we go through and we talk about like, all right, establishing the injury, using lay witnesses to tell the damages story. And then the very next point in that is determine whether there's physical evidence of brain damage. And if there is, show it to them. So I think DTI is fantastic for the right case. Zooming out a little bit, I think that imaging, especially more sensitive imaging. I don't like the term advanced neuroimaging. This type of imaging has been around a really long time. It's just not used clinically as much because from a clinical standpoint, whether or not there's axonal shearing, whether or not there are tears in the brain's wiring may be relatively insignificant in terms of prognosis, diagnosis, and treatment. Where it has application, though, is improving that there's physical evidence of brain damage, most notably in the litigation or forensic setting. DTI I really like for the right case. If you've got someone, we'll just say over the age of 15 or 18 and under the age of 65 or 70, DTI is wonderful. And again, what you're looking at in a sensitive way is whether or not there's any damage to the brain's wires. And the brain's wires are known as axons. Diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI, looks at the damage to those axons and can spit out a real pretty picture that may show, almost looks like color out of spaghetti noodles. And on one side, you may see some long strands, we'll say of yellow. And then you look at the other side, which should look pretty damn similar, if not identical. And those strands are missing. And what that helps establish is those strands, which represent axons or the brain's wiring, are no longer there. They've been sheared. In other words, they've been torn or ripped open. And when they're ripped, they connect a lot of brain cells. And when that happens, the brain cells die and the brain doesn't function as well. So I like DTI. Another type of imaging that's not as flashy and that not as many people maybe talk about, but I think can be really effective, is another type of MRI. And that's something for folks to know. DTI is just a type of MRI. There's another type of imaging. Again, it's a separate MRI setting, and it's called SWI, which stands for susceptibility weighted imaging. SWI, the same way DTI looks for tears in the brain's wiring, SWI looks for little micro hemorrhages within the brain. Where have there been little tears, bursts? Where is there a little bit of microscopic blood on the brain? Not that would pop up like on a CT scan to show a subdural hemorrhage, but where they're just tiny little markers where there used to be little blood spots, and SWI can show that. And again, that's evidence that's consistent with brain injury. DTI can provide evidence that's consistent with brain injury. You can't say because the DTI findings were positive or SWI was positive, that means there conclusively was a brain injury. What you can say, kind of like an X-ray, if you see an X-ray of a broken leg, you can't say based on an X-ray alone what caused it. But if you give someone the information, you say, hey, they got hit by a drunk driver 2 hours before the X-ray was taken, got thrown off their motorcycle. And when they showed up at the scene, EMS had a compound fracture. You'd say, oh, in that case, yes, I would say the broken leg is related to the crash. Well, if you look at the clinical history, someone suffered a 10-foot fall, hit their head, and was unconscious for 5 or 10 minutes, or wasn't, but was disoriented and confused, and you do a DTI or SWI, and you see again that there's damage to the axon or there are microhemorrhages in the brain, it's consistent with the fall. It's consistent with there being brain damage, and based on the clinical history, you'd most likely correlated it, a neurologist or other neurospecialist would, with the actual TBI. One thing to know about that type of imaging, they're not time-stamped, okay? So SWI can't tell you how long ago the blood was there and left an iron deposit. DTI can't tell you how long ago the axons were torn, but it's part of the larger picture. And what you know at the end of the day is there was a person who woke up one way. When they woke up that morning, they were one way. Then let's say we got a case right now, the storage door came down on their head and knocked them out. And after the storage door came down on their head and knocked them out, they haven't been the same. Imaging shows the imaging is consistent with traumatic brain injury. Their friends and family talk about how different the person was before and after in the following different ways in terms of their mood, personality, behavior, and cognition. What do we think the most likely cause of that is? Well, Occam's razor tells us the simplest answer is usually the right one. The defense wants to overlook the fact the garage door, storage door came down on the guy's head, but it did. And when it did, it knocked him out. And ever since, his life's been different. And that's the reason that we brought a case against the storage door company, right? So I'll say all that to say that I'm a big fan of imaging. And if you get positive findings on imaging, show them through illustrations, show them through animations. But I'll also say all this with one caveat: be wary of anyone who's trying to sell you DTI. Be wary of anyone who's trying to sell you any type of imaging, PET scans, functional MRI, SWI. The imaging and the results really are only as good as the technicians doing the work, the normative data set that it's compared against, and the radiologist or other expert who's analyzing that data. So just be careful and make sure not that the technology can pass Daubert, which it can, but that the expert that you're choosing to use is sufficiently qualified.
Yeah, I know that there's lots of people when it first came out, I was like, oh my gosh, well, use this people and use these people. And as happens with a lot of things that are like new and exciting for evidence and animations and that kind of stuff. And it's so true. Like you really want to pick somebody who, knows what they're doing and is not just going around to every lawyer convention and sponsoring everything possible. It's just true, because I think there are probably a lot of people listening who've been like, yeah, I did that. And it turned out either I couldn't use it or it didn't turn out to be what I needed, what it needed to be.
For someone to say your client's brain is abnormal on DTI, for instance, there has to be a normative data set to compare it to. Also, you want to be careful about what else may better explain those findings, right? Like you need to be careful on the age side, that it's not an aging brain, an atrophying brain, that the person isn't older and has small vessel disease, that they're old enough that the axons and the parts of the brain that DTI is really kind of looking at for normalcy or abnormality are properly developed. So, it's a great tool. It's not the end all be all, but it's a great piece of evidence, kind of in the old, like we learned as kids, show and tell. If you can show the jury the injury, if you can show them the brain damage, right? Like a lot of times we'll talk about, look, what happened to them was a traumatic brain injury. What they're left with is brain damage. And now we're going to show you the brain damage. So if you can show them the brain damage and show that the parts of the brain that were damaged are consistent with and medically correlate with the changes in their life, which is something a neurologist or someone else can explain, then you're further layering the evidence again, and also utilizing those lay witnesses. So it becomes a situation where you've got a TBI to start with. You've got people who are talking about how different they are. Now you've got imaging that shows why they're different. So you've got the how they're different. Now you've got the why they're different, and you're able to show it to the jury, which I think kind of leaves you more into how much you're going to get setting versus whether or not you're going to get a result.
So let me ask a question about timing, because you said not every case needs to have like this kind of imaging. Like when are you thinking about this, and when are you making that decision? Because I know, again, plaintiffs, personal injury lawyers, we're pretty cost conscious because we gotta be. So when are you kind of making these decisions, and when do you pull that trigger?
That's a great question. The classic, it depends, right? Typically, in my experience, people who are going to get better, who are going to recover, do so within about 10 or 11 months. The rule that most people follow is 12 to 24 months. From what I've seen over and over, people are pretty much as good as they're going to get at 10 or 11 months. With that said, I've seen a lot of people make substantial improvements between 6 and 9 months. I've seen people who are messed up as a football bat after a month or two, and you're thinking, my God, their life's pretty much freaking ruined. And at 6 and 9 months, they're 95 to 99, maybe 100% better. So be careful. I typically wait until kind of that 9 to 12 month mark, unless we're pretty darn certain the results are going to be positive. I'll give you an example. Let's say a client has positive findings on CT, right? And they've got subdural hemorrhaging, or they've got subarachnoid hemorrhaging, but they've got blood on the brain, right? In those situations, depending on one's kind of a better idea on coverage and some of the other moving parts of your case, in a case like that, we'd probably send them a little sooner to show not only was there an initial finding of a brain bleed, because the defense can be like, well, they had a brain bleed, right? Yeah. And it got better. Correct, correct. And when they came back in and on this MRI, this we'll call it T1 or T2 MRI, the brain bleed had resolved. Correct, correct. Yet they were still complaining of their symptoms. Isn't that true? Yes. Despite the fact that the brain bleed was no longer evident on imaging, correct? Because what they're trying to do is say because the blood had been absorbed, the person's no longer hurt, which is crazy medically. But in those situations, again, if you've got good coverage, good liability, likable client, compelling story, we'd send them out for more sensitive imaging, including DTI, to show what else was going on inside the brain that, again, is consistent with the initial skull fracture or brain bleed. Because then you can say, look, their skull got fractured, their brain bled, and they have permanent brain damage. Now let's look at the ways their life has been altered and what's been taken because of the brain damage. And again, the brain damage all goes back to when the defendant chose to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I know the third option there is people just wait way too late in litigation, and then it's just then it looks like it's a little bit more manufactured, like that you fall into a different set of problems sometimes when we wait too late.
Hey, big time. Yeah. And with that said, if it hasn't been done, because sometimes we won't get a case until a year and a half, 2 years into it. And in those situations, so long as there's enough medical evidence along the way or enough other people besides the client and their spouse to talk about what's been different over the last 18 months or 2 years, we won't rule out doing the more sensitive imaging, but it does come with if the only thing we have is they treated for 2 months, then they came to us, and then the lawyer referred them to somebody, and lo and behold, there was, an alleged brain injury. That's a tougher sell. I'd be more wary of that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Kenny, you've been super generous with your time, but I know there's a lot of people who are like just learning about it. Obviously, there's lots of different. What is a good resource for them? Like, what's a good book? I know that there are lots of books out there on concussion and stuff, but what are some that you would recommend if people are maybe they're just learning, or people who like maybe want to get their knowledge just based a little bit further down the road?
It's a great question. Before I answer it, I'm going to answer that. But before I do, a lot of people may be wondering, like, what about neuropsych? What do we do about neuropsychology? Which neuropsych do you like or not like? Personally, I don't like neuropsychology. I try to stay away from neuropsychology if I can. I don't think it's necessary. If you've got an initial injury, you've got people from the human being's life who can talk about how their life changed at the exact same moment in time their brain was damaged. If you've got a neurologist who can clinically correlate those things, and especially if you've got imaging, traditional CT, traditional MRI, or some of this more sensitive imaging we talked about, at that point, you get a neuropsychologist, so the defense gets a neuropsychologist, and then there's a day of testimony about the MPI2. It's just like, what are we doing here? That's not a knock on neuropsychologists. That's not a knock on the field of neuropsychology. It's just in terms of case presentation and persuasion. I don't know that we need the Wisconsin card scoring test if you can point to an image and show where their brain is damaged. But if someone wants a good resource, here's what I'd say. The best resource I've found is AHA's Traumatic Brain Injury Litigation Group. It's the seminars that this TBI Lit group, I'm not talking about AHA as an entity, but specifically within this TBI litigation group, you're going to meet a lot of what I think are just the best of the best. You're going to meet a lot of, I think, the best cutting edge doctors, lawyers, really being at the forefront of what's going on with the literature, with the medical and scientific advances, with the techniques on being able to best present these cases in a common sense way. So I'd say from a resource standpoint, the absolute best thing that someone could do is join AHA's TBI litigation group and start coming to some seminars. If there was a specific book, it's funny, I just mentioned how I don't like neuropsych, but because it comes up so frequently, I think the Neuropsychological Guide to Assessment or Evaluation Guide to Assessment, 5th edition, a doctor who passed away in the last year or two, Dr. Lezak, Lezak, is one of the co-authors of that book. It's just the Neuropsych 5th edition. I think you got to have that because you're going to deal with neuropsychologists, be it from the defense, from cases that are referred to you. In certain cases that we have, we use neuropsychologists. There are some great ones out there, but you got to know that stuff. And here's what I'd say about neuropsychology. If neuropsychology is being used to assess deficits, a deficit is the difference in how someone was before and after the injury. You can't know the difference between how someone was before and after the injury without getting an accurate baseline. So a lot of times I've seen plaintiff-friendly neuropsychologists talk about, like, oh, this person has these impairments and these deficits. Well, heck, they might have those same freaking and low-end skills and abilities before the injury. By the same token, I've seen plenty of defense folks basically try to claim that there is no difference. They're still average or high average. Well, fact is, before they may have been, quote, superior in some of these domains, and there'd be massive deficits. So you really got to know to an accurate standpoint, or to a really precise point, what they were like before, if you're going to be able to speak intelligibly and honestly about whether or not there have been any changes in their life. And I just don't see a lot of neuropsychological exams that do that.
Yeah, and we could spend a whole episode just talking about psychs, and it's definitely, like you said, best way is just to kind of educate yourself, especially because you're going to go up against one for sure with opposing counsel hiring one. But we will put a link in the show notes to that particular title so that everybody can find it, and a link to the AJ TBI litigation group. Kenny, thank you so much for coming. I know that we've just barely touched the surface on TBI stuff, but I appreciate you just come and give us a light touch. And I think what we focused on is probably the most important thing for people to walk away with, which is go to that scene, go to that exact place and find exactly what is happening in those moments right afterwards, and that 48 hours afterwards, because that's going to be the best place to find the evidence you need to, like you said, strike that match, right, to light that fire. Kenny, if people want to get a hold of you, if they have questions or thinking, you know what, I would love to have Kenny to come to my podcast or come to a CLE for my group, what's the best way for somebody to get in contact with you?
Sure. And just for reference, it's Neuropsychological Assessment, 5th edition. Again, Lee Zach. Best way to get in touch with me, the easiest way is probably just on my cell phone. And that number, we're in South Carolina, but we, like other folks, go all around. My cell phone number is 803-360-6267. And then my email address, it's on our website. It's Berger with an E, Berger, law, SC as in South Carolina. And my email address is kberger@bergerlawsc.com. So folks can feel free to shoot me an email, or like I said, call my cell, 803-360-6267.
And I will put a plug in here, since you didn't talk about it. You have your own podcast. So if people just want to come and learn a little more, what's the name of your podcast?
Yeah, it's a good one. It's called Best Practices with Kenny Berger. Elizabeth was a recent guest. Other Texas folks we've had, Russell Button, Chris Hamilton, who got that $7 billion with a B dollar verdict. His was excellent. Russ's have been excellent. We had Amy Witherite come on and talk about kind of more from a business perspective. I'm trying to think. I don't want to miss anyone we've had from Texas. It seems to me like there may be one or two more, but again, we've had some great guests, from TBI stuff to truck stuff, openings, close, case selection, all in between.
Yeah. Well, it's a great podcast. I encourage everybody to go review it for Kenny, and support the downloads. That always helps more people find the podcast, which is what I'll say as well for this podcast. But I will say another great way to connect with myself or with Kenny is on LinkedIn. I know there's always going to be some dialogue there with lawyers as well. So again, thank you so much, Kenny, for joining the podcast today. We'll put all that good stuff in the show notes so people know how to find you and find that podcast. All right. Well, this concludes our episode. Thanks again, Kenny. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. All right. Well, if you like the podcast, please rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. Follow on LinkedIn. And until next time, thank you.